Thanks, Louisa. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's edition of our NERI seminar series. Today, we'll be looking at Sinéad Mercier's paper, 4 case studies on just transition lessons for Ireland. Now, before I let Sinéad kind of begin her presentation, just to offer a quick bio for Sinéad. She's a consultant on climate change law and policy with a special focus on just transition and human rights. She lectures in environment, sustainability and social justice at Maynooth and has previously worked for the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, the National Economic and Social Council, the Green Party of Ireland and Philip Lee Law Firm. Her new book is on the evolution of environmental and cultural heritage law in Ireland, called Men Who Eat Ring Forts, written with Michael Holly and Eddie Lenihan, published with Askeaton Public Arts and funded by Clare County Council Arts Office Gaining Grant. Now, one thing just before we begin, a bit of housekeeping. This presentation will be followed by a brief response from myself, and after we'll take some questions. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A function, and our chair will be able to present questions to the panelists in that format. Our chat function isn't on, so that's how you can kind of communicate, and feel free to send in your questions as we speak. We'll gather them towards the end. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Sinéad.
Classic. Thank you very much, Paul. I really appreciate the very nice introduction, and delighted to be here today presenting for NERI. And yeah, so great, we'll get right to it. So start. If I can just get confirmation from either Paul or Louisa that it's showing.
Yeah, we can see that and we can hear you.
Great, brilliant. Okay, everybody, so thank you very much for attending this event today, and anyone that's watching the recording as well. I'm going to just kind of outline 4 case studies on just transition that I covered while working at the National Economic and Social Council. So I was commissioned by them to work on, to analyse key case studies recommended by the ILO and the UNFCCC, and kind of internationally what's considered best practice on just transition, and to extrapolate 11 lessons in the end for Ireland for NERI's report on just transition, which was required as part of the Climate Action Plan 2019. So delighted to be here. So firstly, I'm just going to give a quick overview of what is a just transition. Now, this will be quite short because I'd like to get into the case studies in detail, and I've covered what is a just transition before, I believe at the NERI May conference last year. And I'm going to be looking at the 4 case studies, lessons for Ireland from them. So I'll be looking at Germany, the Ruhr and Lusatia, which is in eastern Germany. Also Australia, Latrobe Valley, and Scotland as well, which is a very interesting example of one of the only just transition kind of processes managed and directed by government that's actually looking at a whole economy approach. So Australia, Germany, Appalachia, Canada, many other kind of examples in Spain as well. They're generally focused on just highly fossil fuel reliant regions and how they might transition, while Scotland is an example of a whole economy approach, and something that we could look to for Ireland as well, as it's a very kind of similar population too. And then I'm going to look briefly, if we have time, at Ireland's transition as well, the role of the Just Transition Commissioner, how that contrasts with the Just Transition Review Group that was planned under the Climate Action Plan 2019, and also the Just Transition Task Force that was recommended by the ICTU, as well as as NGOs as well, and the Joint Oireachtas Committee report on climate action. And also a brief overview of the European Commission's Just Transition mechanism under the European Green Deal. So I just want to start with this photograph here of the Maldives. So in 2019, the Maldives, which is a small island developing nation and going to be one of the worst affected countries by climate change. So sea level rise is already having a drastic kind of impact on the region. Many of the leaders in that country are already planning to move their populations wholesale onto the mainland. They can't, if Ireland and other wealthy countries keep breaching climate change agreements and allow temperatures globally to rise to 1.5 degrees, countries like the Maldives will be left underwater. And I think it's important This conference was held underwater before the Copenhagen Accord in 2009, which was due to be the Paris Agreement, but those talks collapsed. So I think it's important when we talk of a just transition, it's also about a fast-paced just transition. And we must not forget that there are also kind of global supply chains in action here, that a just transition is not just a concern for kind of Western developed nations, but also understanding that we're all developing countries, and the global supply chains that we have means that just transition procedures must be provided for countries such as Colombia, where we still get coal from, and countries as well that have a fast-paced transition must be to the fore. And also as well, if we have time, I'd like to just quickly touch on kind of new research that I'm doing on the role of public kind of ownership of energy systems, and whether that kind of allows for a faster paced energy transition. And the example that I've been giving in the kind of the 100-year anniversary this coming December of the Anglo-Irish Treaty is that whether how did Ireland move from an almost 100% electricity system with Ardnacrusha in 1929, apart from Pigeon House in Dublin, which was a coal-fired station? How do we move from that entirely publicly owned 100% electricity that was renewable system to today, where we are continually missing climate targets? And can there be lessons from that process in terms of also providing for very cheap and affordable energy access to swathes the population of the rural electrification scheme? But I'll touch on that at the end. So firstly, just a quick overview of the origins of just transition. This is kind of the basic intro. So the Paris Agreement preamble. So what the Paris Agreement is under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which started out in the 1990s and was an agreement that countries should come together to tackle the issue of climate change. There was the Kyoto Agreement originally, which agreed that countries should cut emissions, but it should only be developed nations, as they were very wealthy and could afford to do so, and it caused most of the problem. And then in 2015, you had the second kind of follow-up agreement, which was the Paris Agreement. And what this did was bring countries together, all countries, to get them to cut their emissions in a kind of fair and just manner. And one of the statements was that when countries are cutting emissions, they should take into account the imperatives of a just transition of the workforce, the creation of decent work and quality jobs in accordance with nationally defined development priorities. And the just transition kind of statement within the Paris Agreement is the first time that you actually had this statement in a piece of international law, the requirement for a just transition, but also statements on human rights, the rights of Mother Earth, the rights of kind of vulnerable populations such as women, children, people with disabilities in a transition, and also the need for climate justice. Those were all kind of key principles that were entered into international law, into this agreement, through a coalition of trade unions, climate NGOs, global South groups, indigenous groups, all working together. And for the lead up to the Paris Agreement, 400 trade unionists came together with those groups. And there's a few very good articles which I can send on to anyone who asks on how this really revitalized the trade union movement into kind of an organizing model at an international level, working with climate, environment and indigenous groups and global South groups. But this had been worked on for many, many years. So though we hear about just transition from 2015, there's a whole fascinating history from Tony Mazzocchi, who worked with the Chemical and Atomic Workers Union in the US, who is kind of credited with the term in that he was fighting for the peace movement, but also wanted to ensure a just transition for workers in atomic factories and chemicals factories, that they wouldn't be left behind and treated better than dirt. So he called for a super fund for dirt and workers. And also as well, Sharon Burrow has been really leading on this within the ITUC. And you also have many trade unions on the ground as well around the world, particularly global South ones, such as in South Africa, really working on this. And what happened with the Paris Agreement was that the lead up to the Paris Agreement, you had in September 2015 the Sustainable Development Goals agenda agreed on. And within the Sustainable Development Goals, you have goal number 8, which calls for decent work and economic growth, and goal number 13 on climate action. So the Paris Agreement should be seen as kind of a lead on from the Sustainable Development Goals. And indeed, the two are now very much connected in the new IPCC 6 assessment report. That is kind of the scientific advice that underpins the international work on climate action. And they have found that the faster climate action is faster and better and more coherent if it's attached to the Sustainable Development Goals and the manifestation of those goals. Now, you do have a severe conflict between decent work, climate action and economic growth and environmental sustainability. So that is something to keep in mind. There's many degrowth theorists such as Jason Hickel or Kate Raworth who kind of argue that you can better achieve decent work and climate action within more kind of a degrowth or a growth perspective, but we'll leave that question for another day. But suffice to say that the just transition principles were then kind of were firstly developed by the ILO, and then they were then further developed under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in a technical guidance document published in October 2016. So there's a risk that the term just transition can be kind of watered down into like a meaningless idea of general fairness. But just to understand that there are actually a number of international agreements and international kind of documents that Ireland and other countries have signed up to, such as the Silesia Declaration as well in Poland, which also kind of reiterate these statements that you need to consult all stakeholders, you need social dialogue, provide social protection and good government programs as well. And this is now a foundational part of the European Green Deal, the term just transition, that when the European Green Deal kind of upgrades all of Europe's action on climate after the Paris Agreement, it was a way to bring the Paris Agreement into the governance regulation, which was a new kind of framework for climate action in Europe. And as part of that, as part of these kind of newer, like a 55% cut in emissions by 2030 and reaching net zero by 2050, that these drastic cuts will be accompanied by a statement that the European Commission will leave no one behind. So a promise to workers, but also to the marginalised and vulnerable across Europe, suffering from higher energy prices and so on, that they would not be left behind in the transition. And there was recognition that past transitions and past kind of climate action initiatives may have damaged these communities, as well as kind of other like deindustrialization across the EU as well. This recognition that we must make amends for that and ensure that that doesn't happen again. So again, you see the Sustainable Development Goals and donut economics phrase in the European Green Deal. And this is where you get the just transition mechanism. Now, it's since been cut under the COVID fund for Europe, from 40 billion originally to only 17.5 billion, but I say only, but it's talking in billions. But and the primary kind of beneficiaries of that will be Poland and Germany. But Ireland is also set to get a good amount of funding too, if it provides an adequate just transition plan under its national energy and climate plan under the governance regulation. Also as well, there's movement at international level to provide proper indicators for the funding that will be provided from the private and public sector as well, that these are in line with the European Pillar on Social Rights. So again, there are legal frameworks there, and there are kind of hard boundaries and commitments that outline what a just transition actually means and what the indicators are. And that's important to keep in mind, that Ireland needs to align its just transition plan with the European Pillar of Social Rights that's within the European Green Deal and also stated within the just transition mechanism legislation itself. So now to go to the NESC report I worked on, with the NESC report addressing employment vulnerability as part of a just transition in Ireland. And we were delighted in March 2020 when Michael D. Higgins himself, the president, in a very rare move, actually endorsed the report and said that it was a contemporary candidate for the Whitaker Report, the first programme from economic expansion in 1958. And this was kind of a very rare statement by the president, and kind of very much in keeping with his own kind of writings and work around environment, sustainability and social justice as well. Very much kind of bringing over international academics such as Mariana Mazzucato and Kate Rayworth and others to kind of debate what does climate action look like in a kind of socially just context. I was very proud and delighted to have contributed to the research with NESC. I was commissioned to look at 4 case studies on just transition and extrapolate a number of lessons from that. And just to give a bit of background on where the council report came from, it was commissioned under the Climate Action Plan 2019, so that we were required to look at how Ireland can transition to a low carbon economy in terms of the digital impacts that would have on employment, as well as the climate impacts as well. And it was under the Future Jobs programme as well by government at that time. And the role of myself was to assess international experience and best practice of climate-focused just transition and lessons for the Irish case. And I really recommend reading Dr. Jean Moore's accompanying paper, Approaches to Transition, which looked at kind of what does just transition mean, the origins of the phrase and the principle, and kind of what other countries are kind of interpreting it as, because it's very interesting. There's a range of different approaches. And there's a growing kind of movement as well, as Edward Morena kind of stated in a recent conference by NESC and the EEAC, that the term is now kind of being taken up in a very positive way by other kind of social justice groups and movements, and that can be very invigorating for the climate movement and for public policy going forward. So I explored case studies to extract policy recommendations, a practical framework to help workers, and core principles alliances that promote job and environmental quality as well. And just to reiterate there, this kind of that there are wider social justice concerns now being debated within a just transition kind of principle approach. So one academic who's really leading this area is Ian Goff, and he discusses the fact that it's well known that there's a double injustice with climate change, in that you have those who contributed least to climate change, so particularly those in the global south, who don't have kind of highly industrialized economies, who often had their resources kind of taken through the process of the Industrial Revolution and colonization, and so never got to kind of and yet those countries are then going to be the worst affected by climate change, purely geographically speaking, and that they happen to be in areas that are already quite arid or already kind of in the path of El Nino kind of storms. And also as well, they don't have the resources and money to kind of build large flood barriers or other kind of efforts. But he does point out a triple injustice, in that the climate policies that we choose to deal with climate change, to deal with the problem, have not been kind of adequately hashed out. There isn't sufficient kind of knowledge within the political system about what climate change is, how it impacts on different groups. There isn't sufficient data, like in Ireland, for example, the climate adaptation plans provided by local authorities, none of them really assess, well, they assess kind of areas that will be worst affected by climate change, but they don't assess who lives in those areas. So one thing that we do know is that generally floodplains, for example, are kind of occupied by people kind of lower socioeconomic status, and we know internationally that they will be worst affected by climate change, according to Philip Alston and many other UN rapporteurs on climate change, on extreme poverty. But do we know how that we are going to deal with that in Ireland? And unless you have the data, you can't avoid that triple injustice. And Ian Goff also points to the fact that you will get situations where in our current neoliberal framework and our current kind of dismantling of the welfare state or of a strong state, that you will get climate policies that again have this idea of trickle-down economics, of cutting kind of and making life more difficult for the poor, assuming in a Malthusian kind of manner that it is the poor that cause climate change, rather than the evidence which shows from Oxfam and many international reports by Thomas Piketty and others, which show that the wealthy are actually the primary causes of climate change, and really a top 10 or 1% internationally. But I do recommend reading. I was a rapporteur for the 28th EEAC annual conference, Delivering a Just Transition for All, that NESC hosted in Dublin Castle. And that was a really brilliant kind of look at following on from Jean Moore's research there, approaches to transition, to open it up to kind of wider issues such as Vincent de Paul there on energy poverty. So if you want to kind of look at that overarching perspective, I recommend. So to kind of look at our 4 case studies of Germany, Australia and Scotland. So just to start quickly with Western Germany. So the Ruhr Valley, the Ruhr Valley in Western Germany is kind of considered one of the best kind of practice examples of just transition in terms of, it was a very kind of well managed phase out of coal and steel industry, while also looking after the workers there, and also transitioning the entire region, which historically has been, I mean, the foundation of the European coal and steel community, a foundational kind of highly resource intensive, and in many ways encouraged to be reliant. The community was encouraged to be reliant on only fossil fuels. Like Bismarck, for example, didn't want any university to be built in the area because he feared that the sons and daughters of coal miners, if educated, would be a terrible threat. So the region was kind of encouraged by the state to be rather overly reliant on coal and steel, also to keep kind of wages low and less competition. And the transition itself took around 60 years, but finally came to an end on the 21st of December 2018. And the decision to shut the last coal mines was made in 2007 for largely economic reasons. The industry had become quite heavily reliant on subsidies, and also was kind of, the region itself wanted to transition to alternative technologies such as in engineering, in renewables, and also a very kind of highly paid industry in environmental protection, which is quite interesting. A lot of environmental lawyers, a lot of kind of experts in environmental rehabilitation were trained up in this region through direct experience of rehabilitating the mines. Now there are many kind of negative aspects to the Ruhr as well. Like it took an awful long time. There are also kind of debates about whether the region has been sufficiently transitioned, as there are it's still heavily reliant on coal-fired power generation. It's just that the mines were closed. So the difficulties there in how do they actually manage that final process as well. And just to kind of show the drop in employment in the industry, however, it didn't result in the same kind of drop in employment in the region. There were sufficient kind of, not overly sufficient, but from my interviews that I did with kind of policymakers in the region and with unions as well, it does seem that they did manage to stave off kind of an unemployment crisis. But it was a difficult transition for many years. The industry itself really stalled development. They used land and kept land in there and wouldn't share it with new companies coming to the region. They didn't want new companies coming in and creating competition and higher wage jobs for others. And how the transition itself was achieved was through consistent engagement by the highest levels of government. So really rolling up the sleeves and getting in, not being frightened to kind of get in and hash out like an agreement between municipal, local, state governments, employers and trade unions as well. So the state really worked very closely and in a kind of a long negotiation process in these, they were called coal rundes. So periodical kind of roundtables on the industry to ensure that workers received good pay and conditions, and that the coal companies as well were kind of properly managed in their phase out. And there was heavy public investment as well in support of alternative infrastructure, and really focusing on the region as a whole, rather than just, for example, in the UK, with the closure of the mining industry, many individual miners got good redundancies, but the question of what would happen to their sons and daughters was not really kind of adequately kind of provided for. Also as well, there was involvement of those worst affected through the social partnership structures, so workers themselves. Now, there was a lack of engagement with community organisations and NGOs at this time, so that was a critique that came up. But the transition in Germany is not finished. This is a kind of a photo here of Ende Gelände in the Rhineland as well. And Ende Gelände means end of the line. And it's basically kind of a large mass activist kind of group. Like people come from all over the world to block the digging of new coal mines and the use of lignite coal. So that's a softer brown coal that's mined particularly in eastern Germany. And this has kind of raised kind of huge protest internationally, and also kind of in Germany as well, where the public are kind of saying, well, there's huge support for the Energiewende, which is the kind of this move to renewables and kind of community-owned renewables, particularly solar and wind, which really kind of drove Germany as a climate leader internationally, or the perceived vision of it as a climate leader. Real kind of push to ensure that there was part ownership of wind turbines, or full community ownership of wind turbines, and also as well kind of the move away from nuclear. However, there's kind of a double that Germany is kind of having its cake and eating it and continuing to dig for coal while not while also pretending to be taking fast climate action. So that's kind of the context of anger at the time. And one of the regions that's going to be worst affected by the phase out of brown coal is Lusatia, a very kind of rural and sparsely populated region, half of it which is also in Poland as well. And it's already endured major restructuring and job losses during reunification. So this is something very interesting that actually came up time and again in the analysis that I did of the different case studies. I didn't look for these kind of examples, they just happened to arise again, where previous experience of privatization and liberalization and deindustrialization had caused a very kind of nasty transition or unjust transition for communities who are now facing a second one due to kind of climate change proposals. So that context of previous mismanaged transitions is very live in these particular regions, highly fossil fuel reliant regions. And in Lusatia, in East Germany in general, employment dropped by 90% in just 10 years. And this kind of mismanaged transition created great discontent and lack of trust as well. But there's also the environmentalist side of it, which is that large and heritage side, where the open cast mining required for brown coal requires the removal of entire villages and primeval forest as well. So in the German Coal Exit Commission was then set up in 2018 under the Climate Action Plan 2050 framework, which again was kind of upscaling Germany's targets for the Paris Agreement. This kind of, the Climate Action Plan said that, well, Germany has to kind of look at how do we transition these mismanaged regions away from coal. And in 2018, they launched the Commission on Growth, Structural Change and Employment alongside the Climate Action Plan, which would develop a framework and structural adjustment programme for the full phase out of not only coal mining in Lusatia, brown coal mining, but also hard coal power generation. So hard coal mining had ended in 2018, brown coal mine had to end, and so did power generation. And they set up the Coal Exit Commission, which would have 31 members from coal companies, unions, environmental groups and local government, 4 chairpersons, and they kind of worked over the year to develop kind of proposals for these regions. They came to the recommendation that they would end generation by 2038, and this would be supported by a 40 billion package of structural adjustment support. So this is kind of the outline of the commission itself, with their final and interim report. So this is an example of kind of setting up a specially created kind of social dialogue body, basically, which is something that was also happening in Scotland as well, and happened in the Ruhr in Germany with the Kohler Runde. I forgive my pronunciation of the German. So just to kind of give, just with the investment package, I won't go through this in detail, but the primary thing to know is that to build the the trust in the region. Sorry. What they did was that they ensured that right away, the minute, almost like a few days after the final report and recommendations for closure by 2038 came out, the government immediately started the process for the 40 billion fund. And the fund was also kind of accompanied by very kind of well laid out recommendations for the region. Like they really did have not only a good, well hashed out plan that was developed with this kind of social dialogue, government rolling up the sleeves and getting involved kind of process, but they also ensured that there was going to be very strong funding for it, and that funding was immediately going to be there once the process of closure started. Now there's some anger over the 40 billion in some respects, in that some of the coal companies are getting much bigger payouts than others, and this may not be in line with state aid, European state aid rules. But there is kind of a lot of positives in that there are very good worker transfer schemes, very good plans for reskilling the area, very good plans for Lusatia in general to move over. Now, just to go to the second example, of Latrobe Valley in Victoria, Australia. So after developing kind of the recommendations from Germany, I was asked to look at kind of a smaller example, because Germany is obviously millions of people in the Ruhr and Lusatia as well. So I was asked to kind of look at a smaller kind of example. And what I looked at was the Ruhr of Australia, which is kind of, there's an awful lot of writing, and I believe there's actually 2 Irish academics that looked at Australia as well. A lot of kind of good research and analysis has been done of this region for many, many years. So there was a lot to kind of look at here. And people were very kind in being allowed to be interviewed by myself as well. So this transition period was a bit shorter too, from the 1980s to the present day. And the population is smaller, around 125,000, so closer to the Midlands. And again, similar to the Midlands and similar to Germany, the population was historically encouraged to settle in the region from the 1920s onwards. And there's kind of a legacy here of displacing the Indigenous people as well, the Indigenous kind of First Nations Australian people. And the region produces 85% of the state of Victoria in Australia's electricity, and it's home, or was home, to the heaviest emitting, it is home to the heaviest emitting in general power stations, but it was also home to what kind of environmental kind of campaigners called Hazelwood Horror. So the worst, most polluting coal power station, one of the worst in the world, and particularly in Australia as well. And unemployment, the kind of general context to understand is that the region got kind of an awful lot of media attention recently because of the highly polluting coal station, but also as well in the 1980s, the region had historically been known as a very good place to have work. For example, the town here, Yallern, at the bottom was kind of considered like a 1950s sort of Stepford wife like ideal, very kind of good employment, very good conditions, very good kind of community structures. Now the town itself was removed for the mine, and in the 1980s as well, the industry itself was privatized, and this reduced coal jobs dramatically in a very short period of time. An awful lot of people thought that they would get kind of better jobs and better conditions, but that did not follow. Instead, there was high unemployment, population loss, there was an increase in suicides, and social deprivation as well. And kind of something to understand with a just transition perspective is that it's also about identity that attaches to highly unionized, very kind of community-centered like employment. So if you think of even Bord na Móna, there's the saying that Adrian Kane from SIPTU has said to me, bog men be proud. The idea that, you know, that Bord na Móna led to the kind of the real explosion in the Offaly football and hurling teams, doing very well in those areas, a real sense of community that kind of gave a strong sense of confidence to the region and attracted other kind of employment opportunities as a result as well. But this all kind of fell apart in many ways, or the literature has pointed to this in the kind of 2090s after privatization. And kind of to add kind of salt to the wound, you then had the federal government at the time, the Gillard government, introducing an emissions trading scheme and a carbon tax and carbon pricing, and a contract for closing fossil fuel companies that were going to be accompanied by a 5 billion payout for coal companies who were private and often owned by international companies. And that was going to be accompanied by a very narrow structural adjustment programme for the worst affected communities. And of course, that was entirely rejected. And you got kind of a real sense of the local community being lied to over and over again, the sense of trauma, the idea that they had been left behind before and were now kind of considered something to be set aside or left to the side. That the government knew what privatisation had done, the unjust transition that was there before, and now another one was going to be repeated on the community. But what was positive and great about Australia was that the local community itself, trade unions and local businesses came together to prepare alternatives. So it's an example of where, a contrast to the Germany, where the state really took the leadership and really kind of, with the European Commission, engaged in the closure of the industry and the subsidies, removal of the subsidies. But in Australia, it was actually coming from the bottom up, and trade unions in particular did an awful lot of work with the community to kind of develop alternative worker transition programs and kind of just transition programs in general as well. And there's some great people like Darren Snell who I really recommend looking up. But kind of in terms of how like an unintended or unforeseen consequence can just kind of knock on a transition. There was a major 45-day fire in 2014 that contributed to deaths in the region, and literally the whole mine itself went on fire due to privatisation causing lax health and safety standards at the power plant. And this then led to the plant being closed within 5 months, so barely any notice. And also as well, the nearby sawmill closed as well, with a loss of jobs, and this would have knock-on effects in the region. However, because of the years of working by the community, trade unions and local businesses, they actually had prepared a good plan for the region, which was then backed by funding from the state government. And there was also kind of a regional authority, the Latrobe Valley Authority, set out up in the region, which was made up of local people working with expertise on local development. And they were given the kind of funding on a very kind of longer term basis, owned by the community. They had kind of autonomy from government as well to implement these programs, around 266 million fund as well. So I'm just going to check how I'm doing for time. Am I okay, Paul? One of the two Pauls?
Yeah, keep going.
Okay, keep going, thank you. Great. So glad to be having the time to kind of discuss all of these, and looking forward to what people say as well. But yeah, I'm just going to kind of talk quickly about Scotland too. So again, the feedback from the council, so the social partners in NESC, was again kind of, please look at kind of another country that's very similar to Ireland in size, and also kind of a more, because we were looking at digital transitions as well as climate transition. We decided to look at the Scottish Just Transition Commission, which was something Jean Moore had been engaging with local government there for a while as well. So in terms of, Scotland's a very interesting case study, because it's considered globally like a climate leader. It's meeting its climate targets faster than every other country. It's setting higher targets than the UK of net zero by 2045, not 2050. Ireland, ourselves, we've kind of like danced around the idea of 2050, net zero by 2050. And if we are implementing it, it's going to be, mainly a lot of it is going through offsetting. So that would be kind of using our bogs or using our land use to kind of offset actual reductions in carbon emissions. But Scotland seems to be doing that. Like I was there quite recently actually, and was a bit embarrassed at how well they were doing, and how well politicians kind of were up on the game as well. So they also have a really good organisation called the Just Transition Partnership, which is the NGOs working with trade unions very, very closely to put together kind of proposals on just transition. So in Ireland, there was a similar proposal in 2019, I think, the Just Transition Alliance of Friends of the Earth, Stop Climate Chaos and ICTU. But what they've done in Scotland is kind of consistently work together on proposals and ideas, and it's led to kind of, in my own opinion anyway, kind of a very good broad overview analysis of climate policy, like really kind of hashing out the different unintended consequences that may occur, but because they're engaging with different parts of society. And that's a really positive thing about the Just Transition Commission, which was established in 2015 after lobbying by the Just Transition Partnership. And that has 30 members. It's headed by an IPCC scientist, Jim Skee, and it had a 2-year time frame to hear expert and community evidence and give recommendations to government. And the fascinating thing about it was that the 30 members were from such a wide range of kind of different organizations. Like you had the oil and gas industry, you had the kind of prospect trade union, you had the local authority trade unions, but you also had kind of like community organizations, youth organizations, so they're climate strikers, for example, and also kind of biodiversity NGOs, and also kind of small businesses in, say, Aberdeen and Fife, which are kind of areas reliant on coal and gas, oil and gas. And they really came up with kind of a very good proposal. I really recommend reading their final March 2021 report, which was released in March. And it really exposed kind of different inconsistencies in Scotland. So while Scotland is a climate leader in terms of its climate policy and really big funding as well for climate kind of research, it's a real kind of like global hub for that kind of stuff. But there is kind of a lack of they also are one of the biggest producers of oil and gas in the North Sea. So very similar to Norway in that respect as well. But the Just Transition Commission really allowed for that debate to kind of happen. How do we have these twin activities occurring in Scotland, and how can we ensure that they transition over in a proper manner? Because that just wasn't really happening in Scotland. There was actually a transition fund set up during the downturn in the oil and gas industry in 2014, 2015. But it wasn't actually transitioning workers from oil and gas into offshore wind, which is a huge new area in Scotland, the second windiest place in Europe. And the Skills Development Scotland and an awful lot of the enterprise bodies by government were showing that there was a clear way and very transferable skills from the oil and gas industry into renewables. A lot of the kind of work, even in manufacturing wind turbines, for example, very similar to manufacturing kind of oil rigs. There are lots of industrial sites across Scotland that could take on that work. Similar in Paul, you might know in Northern Ireland, you also have kind of the old shipyards there that were arguing to be used for offshore wind turbines. But what was happening was that the government was taking the same approach that it had taken with oil and gas, in that they were this also comes kind of from the UK and from Westminster more so than Scotland. But you were having a situation where the oil and gas industry was privatised in the 1980s, despite being on Scottish soil, they argued, particularly the SNP. And now you had, and that industry was kind of facilitated in a very kind of facilitative neoliberal kind of state sort of manner, rather than kind of owning it or having a like what they have in Norway, where they have a state fund or state ownership. And the same approach has now been taken with offshore wind, in that local plants and local industrial sites are not being used because the industry is similarly privatized and similarly facilitated through tax breaks or subsidies, rather than kind of taking what the unions and even the oil and gas industry themselves argued to me was actually taking a stronger armed approach and setting up a public company or public initiatives to own the offshore renewables or have a stake in it at least, which was really, really interesting and a lot to learn for Ireland as well. And the recommendations from the final report were to pursue an orderly managed transition to net zero that creates benefits and opportunities, and it has to be a national mission. So this is where this idea of national stake or public value stake in the new industries comes from. Also as well, equip people with skills and education. So rather than just doing reports consistently, which are very good from Skills Development Scotland, actually provide people with skills and education based on those reports. So this was the gap. Skills Development Scotland, I think, have reported about 15 reports on how you can transition people, but the only transition fund that was provided by government was to keep oil and gas workers kind of working in similar industries, or to keep them held over until the oil and gas industry recovered from the crash in 2016. This is even though that it's well known in Aberdeen that the industry is going to be depleted anyway, the reserves. Also as well, the need to empower and invigorate communities and local economies, and share the benefits widely and ensure the burdens are distributed and the ability to pay. And this is something very interesting in terms of the citizens' assemblies that are occurring in the UK under the Institute for Public Policy, is that they are the work of Ian Goff and the work of kind of the Just Transition Partnership to bring the social justice into climate action is resulting in very kind of well thought out policy measures. So looking at renewable subsidies, for example, and oil and gas subsidies, and asking, well, why are they applied downstream rather than upstream? Why is it that we have higher costs and higher energy bills at the bottom and the most vulnerable, rather than looking at how our infrastructure is provided for? So in terms of the 11 lessons, I've kind of covered most of them anyway in discussing them in the case studies, but just to say that they are complex, they take a long time. A Just Transition framework, as in Scotland, really helps to reduce policy incoherence and helps to reveal cross-cutting strands. So by including the voices of everybody, in prioritising social dialogue, you ensure that you don't end up with mistakes like even Ireland has done already, where they supported fracking or they supported gas, thinking they were low carbon fuels. We now know that the spike in emissions in 2018 came purely from fracking, well, not purely, but largely from fracking in the US. So you really kind of avoid those unintended consequences by including everybody's voice. And that's something too important for Ireland's transition here. Also context and past experience. I can't emphasize this enough. They really frame how people see new transition procedures. If communities have felt left behind by past transitions, you're going to have a big job of ensuring trust and building respect and acknowledging what happened before. Also preparation is required for a just transition. Led by government, regional government, local government, but also community actors, recognizing the agency of community actors, like in Australia and in Scotland as well, where you had the Just Transition Partnership, and you also had brilliant organisations in Australia working to develop plans with academics and other community groups. And once that preparation is backed by funding, it can be positive. Also, again, social dialogue is an effective, if not fundamental, mechanism. There can be different ways of having that social dialogue. So in the case studies, you can have new institutional structures established by government, such as a Coal Exit Commission or such as a Just Transition Commission. The Just Transition Commission in Scotland, I have heard critique that it isn't like, there's been frustration from workers that it isn't actually being implemented, the recommendations. But you have that contrast with the Coal Exit Commission, which is being implemented. Also as well, an inclusive place-based approach is necessary. So really taking place by place and valuing what that place can tell you about the skills that are there, about the history of the area, the resources in the area, not kind of taking this approach where one policy recommendation has a one-size-fits-all approach. You're better off kind of looking and really understanding a region and then making recommendations for it, which now I would apply to all climate policy, to be honest. I think this idea that you can take one type of climate policy, such as one blunt instrument, and apply it internationally, like in Australia, that's a really good example there of where the emissions trading scheme and kind of the proposals there for funding the bailout of large coal companies was proposed, which was internationally considered a good idea, but then locally, the fact that they didn't look at the region of Latrobe Valley and the difficulties there resulted in kind of the loss of the Labour government and the breakdown of that, and breakdown of trust as well. So again, uncovering, valuing, cultivating existing skills and capacities. You can do this through skills audits, were found to be very good in Germany. But these need to be alongside a coordinating economic planning role for the state. So in Scotland, there were skills audits done. They did look at skills development in Scotland. They did look at how communities and workers in oil and gas can move into offshore renewables, but the state simply needs to roll up its sleeves and do that coordinating and economic planning role. And that's kind of the gap that's happening here, which came up again and again in the interviews I had as well, even with the oil and gas industry, I should say. The need for state investment in support of alternative infrastructure is the key driver. And this came up again in all the interviews I did. And finally as well, something, not finally, but probably extremely important, most important, well not most important, but certainly very, very important, would be the personnel restructuring processes that are done. So a just transition is not simply about kind of, it must be regional, must be place-based, it must be have social dialogue, but you also need kind of the restructuring processes for those being worst affected. And this isn't just redundancies. As I explained in the UK, the kind of redundancies approach resulted in kind of long-term problems for the region, and kind of regional internal divides as well between those who were long-term employees, did have proper pay and conditions or proper contracts, and those who were kind of, which is similar to Bord na Móna, people who were kind of occasional workers or on worse kind of pay and conditions. And you create a divide then in the community between some getting good redundancies and others kind of treated differently. So a real kind of like approach such as a coal exit commission to really kind of broker a deal on redeployment, and knowing that these people have brilliant skills that they can be reused in other areas, early retirement and internal retraining as well. Something very important, learning on the job and being facilitated through days off to go to a university. I know in the Midlands there's Athlone IT and others are developing great ideas, centres of excellence on climate that should be used. However, that balance must be struck between the community and the environment as well. Longer jobs in the coal industry was the approach that was taken in the Ruhr for years, with companies stalling development, and it wasn't positive from an environmental or community point of view. So just kind of a few final points, because I know I'm coming up on an hour talking to you, but I just want to say that again, as I said, that I feel that there's kind of a spectre haunting climate action, and it's a past lived experience of communities and workers in terms of the unjust transitions that happened. And this is my own opinion now and something I'm researching, but the unjust transitions that happened in the energy system through liberalising and privatising it. And in general deindustrialization, but primarily the way that the energy system was treated as kind of a commercial product, rather than maybe a right or a public good, and a right to clean energy, to be sure. And also it's not just a safety net, it's also about a larger question about how do we get to a social and international order where rights and freedoms are fully respected. So it's about a process and asking how do we get there as well as where are we going. And I feel that kind of question of where are we going to, what is climate action for, once you kind of understand that it's for kind of a better world, for a better social international order, then you can ensure that social justice is very much tied to climate action, rather than, you know, this idea that, you know, allowing some people to be fine and not looking after others. So I just want to check in terms of time with my colleagues, but we can discuss kind of what's happening in Ireland, but just to kind of reiterate, oh yeah, so I just want to kind of end on this note. is that the research I'm doing is looking at liberalisation and privatisation of the ESB. And on the 15th of May, I'll share it with NERI. It's going to be part of a special issue on trade unions, renewable energy and just transition, written with South African, Mexican and United States trade unions. And sorry, just go back here. I just want to make a quick few recommendations for Ireland since the NESC report. There's kind of a lack of now, people listening would kind of have maybe, hopefully there are some people who are more on the ground in the Midlands on what's happening. There have been a series of initiatives in terms of Ireland is now part of the EU START programme and the Coal Regions in Transition platform under the Just Transition mechanism, the Green New Deal. There was a Just Transition Commissioner appointed as well in November 2019. But what's kind of missing is a social dialogue body, I feel. So the Joint Oireachtas Committee report on climate action recommended a Just Transition Task Force, which was being called for repeatedly by ICTU and other unions. Also, the Climate Change Advisory Council has kind of done very good work on just transition, but the addition of Patricia King alone, I don't feel it is enough as kind of a social dialogue mechanism. I think that the Just Transition Review Group that was due to be set up under the National Economic and Social Council, this is stated in the Climate Action Plan and also in the National Energy and Climate Plan that Ireland submitted to Europe under the government's regulation. Yet I haven't heard word of it yet. Now, I could be wrong, something might have changed recently, but I do think that a Just Transition Review Group or a task force where you have that dialogue kind of mechanism would be brilliant in Ireland, as long if it included kind of stakeholders, including the unions, the workers, community groups, such as Vincent de Paul, who are looking at energy poverty, as well as kind of the other social partners as well. And I think that this is kind of the gap that we have in Ireland. There's been great work by Kieran Mulvey, but similar to Scotland, similar to Scotland, there's kind of a gap again between the brilliant reports, great work done by Kieran Mulvey, but we are at risk now of kind of using up the goodwill in the community and the willingness to engage, in that it's not really being followed through with like a coherent long-term plan. I feel that, and I could be wrong, but there do seem to be kind of quite pots of funding for different issues and different sectors, rather than maybe what kind of Mariana Mazzucato recommends, which is the entrepreneurial state. The state kind of saying, just as it did with setting up Bord na Móna, just as it did 100 years ago, with the plan from both Cumann na mBéir and Fianna Fáil, coming together to develop a state-owned, the first state-owned energy system in the world, the ESB, and building this drive to like really build local skills, bring in Siemens from Germany, really build up the ESB to be kind of a world-class energy company, and ensuring that there was that Bord na Móna and the ESB had like a rural employment, a rural development mandate, particularly Bord na Móna, and also ensuring as well that that the ESB was not for profit. It wasn't based on profit, which really has shifted. In the 1990s, that was removed under pressure from the European Commission and the push for privatisation and liberalisation across the EU. And I feel that it's time now to kind of, after 30 years of climate action, which has kind of really gotten us nowhere, the emissions are rising more and more. And if anything, there's been greater kind of human damage, even from climate policies themselves. From kind of this kind of approach that's not maybe taking a coherent or a coherent kind of overarching focus. And perhaps that's what we need to do now. And I think the climate bill, for example, needs to be redrafted. I can speak to people and make recommendations on that later. The Just Transition mechanism is positive. It refers to the European Pillar of Social Rights. Ireland needs to use those social indicators when it's developing its Just Transition plan. It can't be just based on jobs, which is what the current climate bill says. And there also needs to be overarching strong targets in forums and good, strong community participation mechanisms. The climate dialogue, for example, which the government was using to get the public sense of climate action, there was no official mechanism to include any of the proposals from the climate dialogue in the Climate Action Plan 2019. And that needs to be done under the Aarhus regulation. Also as well, lack of data on vulnerability and climate human rights impacts. in general. So I'm going to end there. Thank you.
Okay, Sinead, listen, thank you very much. That was, it was an hour, but my God, it was a very diverting hour and we covered a lot of ground there. Sorry, I should introduce myself. I'm Paul McFlynn. I was meant to start the seminar with you, but technical difficulties forbade me. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Paul Goldrick-Kelly, who's going to give the response, and then we will get to questions after Paul's presentation.
Thanks, Paul, and thank you, everybody, and thank you, Sinead, actually, for a very interesting presentation. And I recommend, if you want a really comprehensive overview of just transition experience, do read that report. There's a lot of work from NESC that's very valuable. Now, Sinead has kind of brought us into some kind of specific examples. I suppose at this point I'll bring things to the hopelessly abstract, and thankfully for everybody, I'm not going to be too long, so we'll have time for questions and answers. But I'll essentially start just with a few charts, even from a working paper co-authored recently with my colleague Lisa Wilson and two great interns, Ian Walsh and Esme Sheridan. But just to sort of start, okay, where are we in terms of emissions performance? And a crucial thing here, and I suppose this kind of relates even to international elements of policy and how we kind of conceive of this problem. If you see kind of on the chart below, those I've separated out the emissions associated with economic activity, basically outside the household, because the household is a big emitter in its own right. That's that blue bar down the bottom. You can see that's pretty consistent and pretty significant. But depending on how you measure it, essentially the two different measures, there's territory, so that's emissions on the island as measured on the island, and emissions basically attributed to Irish residents, which includes companies that are officially registered in Ireland. You start to see a big divergence in 2013. And if you look at the two trends, the resident emissions trend does not look very good. We've only recently kind of started to decline in emissions. We had actually reached a maximum in 2018, whereas if you take the territorial basis, we reach it in 2016 and we start falling. Now that's actually relevant to the question of whether we're in the kind of language of today, decoupling. Are we able to kind of continue developing our economy, whether that's in terms of output, if you think GDP is the goal to be attained here, or employment, is better performance or better kind of economic indicators, is that growing at the same time as emissions are falling? Are they sort of trending in two different directions? The next slide here says it's very much dependent, really, on how you measure it. So that GNI, the classic GNI, now that's of course distorted by a lot of multinational activity, etc. That's been tending upwards, and depending on your metric, now we've started to see some flattening, and recently from 2018 to 2019, with the latest available data, a bit of a absolute decoupling, they call this. So instead of just it growing slightly slower than the economy at large, it's actually starting to trend downwards while the economy grows. Now, it's a far better story if you look at it from the perspective of those territorial emissions, as mentioned. So continuing on that front, if we take it, and as Sinead rightfully mentioned, there's a lot of debate and sort of an empirical question as to whether you can actually have an economy that's continuously growing, that lives within sort of planetary boundaries. So if we take the target of something different and we target, so is employment still growing, or employment being maintained in the face of emissions reductions? If you take it on the basis of territorial emissions, the period 2016 to 2019, you can see that that diamond there, that constitutes the amount, and this is a breakdown. So even as that light green bar tells you that employment has grown, the decline in emissions per job actually managed to outweigh employment growth and drag that downwards. And that's exactly the trend we want to see, though that still isn't occurring fast enough, given kind of what we know from the recent IPCC reports and scientific evidence. And again, to foreground the compositional question in terms of the sectors that we'll have to focus on, and that might be relevant to just transition. We can see, so D there that relates to electricity generation. So you can see that between 2008 and 2019, it was the most emissions intensive sector, at least on a territorial basis. Emissions grew, but there was a substantial reduction in emissions, about 6 million tons of carbon equivalent between 2008 and 2019. So it's still a high carbon emitting sector. It still has a lot of work potentially to do, but it's been the leading kind of component in any environmental success we have had. Whereas the agricultural sector, unfortunately, that's actually increasing in the intensity per job while employment is falling, and emissions are approximately 1 million tons of carbon equivalent higher, as you can see on that chart here. So that kind of raises key questions here in terms of where, I suppose, currently Bord na Móna is the focus, but there are wider kind of structural impediments within the Irish economy that we'll have to focus on, we'll have to sort out and target. So that brings me to, I suppose, a bit of an abstract consideration, but the interaction of this with our kind of wider political economic structures here. So the quintessential successful case that's often relayed, and Sinead told us a lot about the specifics of that success, occurs within Germany. And now this literature is to describe economies, the versions of capitalism. So Germany is often described as a coordinated market economy. It's characterized by a lot more kind of features like collective bargaining, coordination with the government, other firms within the sector to sort of make plans. And that's, as Sinead has pointed out, very conducive to making these plans and facilitating a just transition. Whereas the likes of Ireland, the UK are more liberal market economies. Things are a lot more conflictual, and they tend to kind of be defined by a lot less, for example, vocational training, a lot more competitive or adversarial relationships between employers and employees, which I would argue might present a wider sort of institutional impediment to a lot of this just transition work potentially. So just pointing to some work that looked at how the differences between these two institutional kind of broad types in carbon performance, they tend to, places like Germany, your Swedens, etc., they are characterized by a lot more incremental and continuous innovation. They have an entrepreneurial state, and that coordinates with industry and educational bodies to kind of make those incremental improvements, which is very important in the context of renewables or green technology. As I say, you've a developed state industry science nexus, really where firms, banks, research sector, they cooperate, and at least classically, they'd be seen to kind of embody much more of a long-term perspective. So they're not guided by short-term perspectives around profit, which allows them a lot more kind of patient finance, which is key to a long-term project such as this. As I say, an emphasis on vocational training. I note Sinead mentioned this briefly, and it comes up in her report that in the Scottish case, there's a complaint regarding the availability of these skills. Actually, there's very portable skills, and we had a similar finding in relation to a paper in 2019 that there's a lot of skills actually, particularly in the energy sector. Now we defined it in broad terms in terms of broad kind of educational attainment levels, but they're in the right sort of areas to transition to the green economy. But the absence of in-job training, a lack of kind of vocational training, even apprenticeships in relevant fields to work within the sector are underdeveloped. So even with something like a developed kind of just transition, we're trying to build state capacity, and it's running into kind of roadblocks in this respect. As Sinead mentioned as well, there's a lot of work that says a mission-oriented entrepreneurial state with sort of a comprehensive and stable support focus, very integrated support focus, would be a lot more facilitative of this kind of transition. And at least there used to be, although it's recently changed, there used to be a lot of emphasis within Germany of development of renewables that were community owned and decentralized, although a lot of the more recent shifts have opted for larger firms. And that might be actually, we might get into this discussion, I won't keep it too long, but related to liberalization at a broader level, and perhaps a conflict between a sort of financialized capitalism and the necessary transition. So just to point out a few perhaps worrying features that might kind of place us somewhere on this quickly, and we'll stop and go for questions. Ireland has a very low public R&D spend. That's pretty typical of a liberal market economy. And we also have deficits actually when you adjust for the size of our population in terms of education, which again, not very favorable in terms of the shift. Some indicators, if you go more broadly to the concept of the circular economy, Europe produces indicators that show patents related to environmental technologies, for example. And that's pretty underdeveloped in the Irish case, even adjusted for our population. As I mentioned, we don't really have many of these coordinating institutions that work so well in the German case. Or if we do, they're often piecemeal within a sector. And that raises the question, is that a model perhaps to imitate? Should we build a different sort of state, different sort of institutions to interact, to build something like a green economy and green recovery? And at that, I'll leave things there just so we have time for a bit of a discussion, and we can take a few questions. Thanks.
Excellent stuff, Paul. So we actually have a lot of questions, because that's what the benefit of covering a lot of ground. But I'm going to try and kind of group a few of them together, sort of under themes, so we can get as many across. One thing that's sort of a theme that's come up is kind of, and it touches on what you were saying there as well, Paul, in terms of the forms of capitalism. But it came up obviously in your presentation as well, Sinead, in terms of the role of public ownership. Jerry Slevin raises the point about obviously Scotland and Norway having the resources from their oil and gas industry to be able to fund a change, but then also the role of the community ownership in Norway. But McDowell Doyle, brings up the point, is there any evidence of a transition from, in any way, a transition maybe at all, but a just transition taking place without the coordinating role of the state, and what that sort of, I suppose, means for our economic model overall? If you want to, whoever wants to take that up first.
I suppose I can take up a little bit of comment before I pass over to Sinead. Sinead would probably be a lot more sort of up to speed with the relevant examples, but as far as I know, and when we've looked into these examples, many of the cases of failure really are those cases where they don't have those institutions and they don't have an active role for the state. They sort of let the cards fall as they may, and they said, well, if this industry isn't sort of economically viable anymore, your classic Welsh coal country, or even sort of Appalachia in the United States, where you let the firms kind of go to the wall, or you let them stop because it's not economic anymore, but you simply end up with a spiral of regional sort of depression, really. And where people have available green jobs, they often leave. But I suppose Sinead can kind of speak to that a bit more.
No, that was great, Paul, and thank you very much for your response there. Really, really interesting. And I just want to quickly recommend, there's a great lecturer called Dr. Ciara Ahern in TU Dublin, who's been looking at apprenticeships in Ireland in retrofitting. So it might be worth some of the questions, people asking questions around that, to link in with her. She was great. In terms of the private market, there's different, well, I suppose there's a great article again in a book by Edward Marina, is the editor of it, called Just Transitions, Social Justice in a Changing World, I believe. And there's a great article in there which kind of tracks the language of just transition within the kind of the business sector. And I suppose the argument within that article was that, there's a lot of talk of just transition, like the B team, for example. But then when it actually comes, one example would be Virgin Airplanes, that there's a lot of kind of like campaigning on climate by their founder and campaigning on just transition, but then kind of intervening in talks in his own companies to kind of block kind of trade union organizing. So But then I did interview the coal transition platform, a lovely, his second name escapes me just for the moment, but his name was Robert, and he was brilliant. And he kind of outlined to me the steps that are being done in the offshore wind sector because of the private industry, that the shift in development there has been great because of the private industry. But certainly I would feel that just the experience in Hazelwood with Engie, which is actually, and this is the very interesting thing, because even in Ireland, for example, the oil and gas companies that we have that came into Ireland when Ireland's system was kind of liberalised and privatised, a lot of our kind of oil and power generation was sold to the private industry. And they actually don't recognise, I think, the ESB group of unions, even though some of the staff in those power plants that were sold to them were originally in the ESB group of unions. But they, the interesting thing is that those companies are actually previously publicly owned companies that were privatized. So this is the interesting thing, because, this is the interesting thing with the ESB as well. Like, I think it's not, because Engie, which is the company that shut down Hazelwood, that is a French public company that now has kind of its not-for-profit mandate was removed, and then operated as a kind of international multinational corporation, which treated its workers in like without proper kind of human rights kind of standards. And this is, yeah, it's the interesting thing. I think it's not just about whether a company is private, but I think the overarching and underlying ethos of it, as you, Paul, there outlined the difference between coordinated market economies and liberal market economies, and what a corporation is facilitated to behave like, or prevented from behaving like, in a system that's prioritizing profit. So yeah, then there's like the German companies are privatized, or partly private, technically speaking, but wouldn't behave in the same sort of very, very destructive manner that they did in Australia.
Yeah, just even to sort of build on that point briefly, there's an interesting literature that even says that that's related to kind of questions of corporate governance, that in the likes of your centrally coordinated market economies, there's a lot more room for kind of stakeholder governments, which means that managers can undertake things like long-term investment, patient financing, without having to be subject to the whims of shareholder value and stock market valuations and things like that, which sort of tends towards much more of an instant kind of profit and pretty competitive and pretty adversarial kind of set of relationships, how you treat your relationships with unions and everything else. It's sort of that natural kind of built-in collective bargaining approach has its sort of reflection in what corporations are for, how they're governed, and kind of nearly what is their purpose. Now, they're all to be profitable, I suppose, but there's a lot kind of in terms of what government or what corporations are geared to do, even ostensibly public ones. If they're directed to act like private ones, they likely will take that short-termist approach, or be quite adversarial to anything that requires them to kind of patiently lay down finance in something uncertain, like green technology or development.
So that's basically the values are what matter, not irrespective, but the public isn't necessarily going to act benevolently in that situation either. But as regards to we came up with the Scottish example, Sinead, and the idea of a national just transition, and a question just came in there on the regional versus the national approach, and whether the place-based approach can sort of lead to a kind of a whack-a-mole, where you are being able to tackle issues in climate change in one region and then missing it kind of in the other. And Fiona Dunn was asking about strategic policy committees in local authorities, and what kind of actions are relevant for people involved or stakeholders involved in those kind of discussions.
Great. Yeah, no, that's a great question, Fiona. One local development company that's doing really well is Offaly. Offaly Local Development Company is engaging, they've just gotten funding under the Climate Action Fund, I believe it is, to kind of bring in stakeholder engagement on climate action and get in kind of the public views on what they want to happen or what could happen in their locality. And there's I can post it in the chat after this question, but there's a really good video with Offaly local development company and Kieran Mulvey, both discussing about the Midlands and kind of the plans there. So the yes, I would kind of local actions. I would kind of take a look at what Offaly is doing. I would also kind of commission research locally on kind of who is the most vulnerable to climate, like taking into account what Paul has kind of outlined there, who are the workers in the region. You know, like we're getting a focus, as Paul has said, on climate, on Bord na Móna, but I mean, this just transition is also going to be watched by the farming community. I mean, how are we going to ensure that they are going to be looked after properly and cared for? Because there have been unjust transitions in the farming community. We've pushed people into taking on huge debt for beef and dairy, an industrial kind of style on family farms, which doesn't really fit. Trying to be like the bigger players that don't have family farms, and we need to ensure that there's trust then for the future of farming in Ireland. So that could be one thing. Also looking at kind of, you know, I mean, who, like the climate dialogue, for example, didn't have any kind of facilities to bring in actually very vulnerable groups. So travellers in particular suffer very heavily from energy poverty due to the use of generators for their accommodation. Are there ways that local authorities can develop procedures to ensure proper participation in decision-making on climate for those people who, you know, mightn't have the free time to come to like a town hall meeting, and also commissioning research to see like where are the floodplains, who lives in those floodplains, kind of the Centre for Environmental Justice with Rose Wall and Rebecca Keating would be great to kind of link in with there. They're looking at social housing and how like the energy poverty in social housing is very high, particularly rental accommodation as well. So yeah, I can chat to you further, Fiona, if you like, on that.
Just as well on the point about the national versus the regional just transition, are there things that should be left to the national, you know, the national government, and are there things that are better done more on the ground level in your experience of these cases?
Yeah, so that was something really interesting about Germany, because in the Ruhr, it took so long to transition the region because they kind of took they have very good decentralized kind of local authority kind of governance in Germany. And they left it kind of in the beginning to that local authority governance function, which works quite well generally. But what happened was that the vested interests kind of took it over. And then obviously you have the workers in the area, the community who makes money off it. So they just didn't, it was more difficult to kind of break that kind of reliance. While the national government, once they did start getting more involved from the 1980s onwards and kind of meeting particular targets, requiring the coal run days to actually happen, you did have a break in that that difficulty. And Bella Galgozzi, I'm pronouncing his name terribly, but from the ILO has some very interesting research on that.
I suppose this actually, this kind of questions comes sort of to what Paul brought up as well in highlighting the agricultural sector, and this kind of the trade-off between the required reductions of emissions in the agricultural sector versus higher emissions being driven by data centers in particular. How do we approach that particular trade-off?
I do think that's a very important point, and I think, I mean, in many senses, it sort of highlights as well the need to consider the environmental crisis in the round. The emissions crisis is one of its elements, but there are many other cycles that we're disrupting. So just on the point about the data emission centers, there's sort of indirectly what it implies in terms of materials use that we might be exporting to another part of the world. We don't see it, so perhaps we don't care. And there's even the issue of if we're going to electrify the grid, but we're adding, I think there was an estimate that said that the data centers planned will add electrical demand about the size of Dublin City onto the grid. We're trying to sort of meet a a higher kind of generation target through renewables, with all those kind of attendant difficulties, and what do you do in terms of the load that kind of needs to occur if the wind isn't blowing and everything else, and storage, etc. And you're plonking something new on the grid, and the sort of vision that it's immaterial, it's the cloud. It's actually a very substantial sort of material footprint for these things. So when we're planning these things, I suppose that speaks to one of Sinead's points about this being integrated. And I suppose it also sort of speaks to there's regional, national dimension to this, and there's an international development dimension of this, that we really need international coordination. A world in which we're not really coordinated on this is a world where the necessary changes don't happen, frankly. So yeah. It needs to be organized on many different levels. It's a complicated ask, but it's fairly necessary.
I suppose there's a danger of the agricultural sector sort of seeing themselves in the firing line, but them being viewed as an old industry on the way out, and then then seeing them multinational data centers coming in and creating arguably a bigger problem whilst they're being pushed out. So altogether or not at all, I suppose, is the point you're making with regard to that. Sinead, you mentioned the retrofitting. We've had a good few questions in on that, and what is its capacity to really create that kind of job replacement in industries affected. I mean, I suppose retrofitting is a countrywide program that could take up, but I mean, there's a few questions here, sort of maybe questioning its capacity and the low take up of it thus far. If you want to say a wee bit more about that.
Yeah, I'll say something quickly, because actually I think Paul and Kieran Nugent, you did some very interesting work on the kind of lack of job, that in the Midlands there are an awful lot of jobs that people did have, say, during the boom, like a construction work on sites during the summer, that would supplement income for college for many kind of younger people, and that employment isn't there anymore. So that's something interesting. But before you get to that, I'm sorry, I took 1 hour and I'm taking more. But I want to say just, yes, I do think that there's huge job opportunity in retrofitting, and the cost is enormous. So it's around 50,000 for a house, 30,000 if you do manage to get all the grants, but then the grants are dependent on you putting up the funding first. So, and under the current climate action plan, the finance that is planned for the transition, a lot of it is actually dependent on private homeowners putting up that finance first, and then in Germany, they did actually try that, the loan scheme that is currently being proposed to finance that, and it didn't work. It wasn't taken up. Oh, and in the UK as well, their Green New Deal that they had under the Lib Dem government, that didn't work either. They tried to rely on loans to do the retrofitting. And this is, for me, is the fascinating kind of crux of the issue, because energy efficiency is kind of probably the most boring, but certainly the most kind of, in terms, it's extremely jobs intensive and extremely socially just. You basically eliminate Ireland's high rates of energy poverty. You eliminate Ireland's kind of issues of damp. You improve our housing stock, which for a long time has been terrible. But the reason why it's not being done is because our energy system is kind of not going to where the benefit is. I mean, it's not that climate action is difficult or unprofitable, or kind of won't bring about kind of positive dividends for everybody. It's that it won't bring about positive dividends for a vested interest of the few. And this is kind of the question for our energy system, is that do we want to encourage profit in the energy system, which means that we're never going to be energy efficient, because that's where the drive for data centers and more growth is coming from. We have to reorientate it and think in different ways. We need different economic indicators. We need a different conception of GDP. We need a different conception of our energy system, which is very similar to what we did less than 100 years ago. In the 1930s, ESB was not for profit. It was only for profit in the 1990s. And then I think that it would be much easier to do these retrofitting projects, because the focus will be, just as Bord na Móna was when it was first set up, will be on rural development and rural jobs and rural employment. That's why Bord na Móna was set up. Indeed, Cumann na Gael gave out all the time to Sean Lamass, saying the only reason why Bord na Móna existed was to bolster the votes of Fianna Fáil. Like, it didn't make the country any money. It was actually considered a drain, but yet we did it. And this is the question with retrofitting. We can do these things easily. It's just that we're applying a human economic framework to natural systems, you know. Yeah.
Well, I think if anything, the last year has proved to us that when an actual proper crisis comes up and actually confronts us, we can do a whole lot more than we thought we were previously capable of. I should just say on the retrofitting, give a message there from Tommy Simpson to say that the Dublin Council of Trade Unions is having a seminar on the 16th of June on the practical applications of just transition, and there will be details of that later on, but great to see events like that happening throughout the trade union family. Another question that came up there, and I think it actually tacks on to the end of your point there, Sinead, about how do we measure the success of a just transition? That obviously it can't just be about the quantity of jobs replaced, but the quality. And has there been any work on setting an actual framework to say from start to finish, you know, almost like a scorecard of how just transitions actually perform, or any kind of agreement on that? Whoever wants to go first there, go on, Sinead.
Yeah. Like, is there kind of an outlined plan or frame? Well, the NESC report is great, and it's been endorsed by the president. And I think the plan was that the Just Transition Review Group would be set up to kind of implement those proposals through, again, the kind of social dialogue process. So that was, I think that's kind of a good plan, because the NESC report is quite a good framework, and it also takes into account like the digital transition and the issues of data centers as well, which are high intensity carbon wise, but low intensity jobs wise. So that could be one way to do it, but it is very much kind of an area in flux as well, which is really invigorating. And I believe Paul is working with you on his PhD in the area as well, so you'll be learning a lot. But I think it's up to, I think lessons from Scotland and lessons from Australia is for the trade unions to really step up and kind of start preparing their own plans, because the transition is happening. The question is kind of how awful is it going to be? You know, and this is where preparation is really key, either by states or by like those on the ground, such as trade unions, and NERI, I think, is really well placed to start preparing that.
Just even, I suppose, to add to Sinead's point, I think, Sinead, you mentioned the submission to the European Commission under the governance framework, which are supposed to outline our emissions plans and how we're going to achieve them and how they'll be consistent with the new EU target. I think the Commission commented that on the Irish report that basically the just transition element was very, very underdeveloped, that they didn't really kind of take account of those questions of skills, the kind of available kind of jobs potentially come down the pipe, planning. It was a lot more just about the kind of raw emissions targets, particularly on the electricity side, really. So yeah.
And I think that the previous government's National Energy and Climate Plan was submitted, so there was no inclusion of the 7% programme for government commitment either. So it's out of date. I think, well, obviously with COVID, I suppose it was a difficult time, but the previous government's, it needs to be updated in general, the National Energy Climate Plan, and the Just Transition Plan as well needs to be attached to the European Pillar of Social Rights. So that is one framework again, and the indicators that are used in the Just Transition Plan, they are focused mainly on, the indicators kind of overlap with the European Pillar of Social Rights indicators as well, so which are kind of based on well-being as well as kind of jobs. So I think that's that Ireland needs to kind of that's one thing that we need to do. Legislative, we need to tie it to the European Pillar, and that's something that maybe a shadow report could be prepared from a Just Transition Partnership kind of group as well.
You know, that's definitely an interesting one. In terms of, we just had a quick question in there about the U.S. Green New Deal, and just sort of any thoughts you've had, and maybe or anything you know in terms of how that is or isn't, and questions about the solar industry being very union unfriendly, and how maybe we tackle sort of issues like that in our own transitions.
Paul, would you like to discuss that one?
You're muted there, Paul.
Always happens. That is something kind of noted in the list, that a lot of these kind of renewable jobs, if there isn't really a kind of coordinating plan, or you just sort of leave it to the market to, well, renewables are becoming cheaper and they'll sort of enter on force, there is a tendency towards these places won't be organized, and often they won't have decent conditions. And there's questions even kind of within sectors like waste and everything, even kind of questions of worker safety and what these workers will be asked to do. So I would agree to that. I suppose that might kind of go back to the framework we use to sort of coordinate these transitions, and the involvement of the state and the involvement of workers, that it isn't simply kind of a company-led initiative, or it can't be allowed really to be simply about decisions, profit-making decisions, when people are involved and communities are involved. And yeah, on the Green New Deal side, I suppose, somewhat, speaking personally, somewhat surprisingly, the Biden administration seems to be taking a pretty ambitious slant towards this stuff. Although there's a good piece by Adam Tooze actually addressing that even given, you know, that kind of eye-watering size of $2 trillion, that's still pretty small in relation, unfortunately, to the size of the challenge. I think he makes a point about funding for R&D being less than what Americans spend annually on pet food, which is a new indicator that I want to really deploy at any opportunity. Yeah,
very relatable.
Yeah. That's very, that's very, interestingly, internationally, the amount of global tax evasion that there is would kind of solve climate change many times over, which is something that the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, Olivier de Schutter, and previously his colleague Philip Alston both pointed to, that, you know, we're focusing on kind of carbon taxes and fossil fuel taxes on end user, kind of very at the end point of consumer fossil fuel taxes. While if we, you know, global kind of investment funds such as Blackstone, which, you know, operate through Ireland and also facilitated the Troika operating in Ireland, they have huge investments in fossil fuels that are almost entirely untaxed, that we facilitate in Ireland. And, you know, those trillions are easily kind of there to hand to deal with climate action, which is something that the UN Special Rapporteur has said. And just to kind of add in terms of the Green New Deal and the solar industry, in terms of this power of trade unions, there actually were hundreds of jobs, thousands of jobs in the German solar industry prior to the crash. And they were mainly kind of female jobs and a lot of service sector jobs, but they weren't organized. The unions had not kind of had not got in there just yet and unionized the sector. And even though the amount of jobs in that sector was significant and almost as high in some accounts as the coal industry, because they weren't unionized and organized, you barely hear anything about the fact that all those people lost their jobs during the crash. In the renewable sector. So this is an important thing, you know, for anybody working in the renewable sector, is that unionization and the Green New Deal kind of approach, where you encourage unions, and that Biden seems to be doing that in his approach as well, is actually great for climate action, because you create a very powerful vested interest, positive vested interest for climate action continually, for more and more jobs going forward. So it's quite clever.
I will ask one final question, and maybe just a brief reply. Sort of the COVID has come up as how it will affect this. Do we think of the current crisis as having a positive or negative effect on our transition? is it going to show that we have the capacity to act big when in the face of a crisis, or is it going to go the other way, and we're going to see people having less enthusiasm for mass disruptions and big interventions? What do you think?
I mean, in many ways, cuts both ways. Perhaps it's to be fought over. I mean, there's the question of perhaps countries, and you sort of saw this in the initial phases. There was a lot of petitioning for the brown sector, the kind of fossil fuel sector, to receive kind of subsidies and bailouts and financial help, on the argument, well, you know, the economy's crashing, you have to sort of bring us back to where we were. So I guess it's a matter of, can we use this, can we envisage a recovery that shapes the economy in a fundamentally different way? And there are positive signs. I mean, the Green Deal is positive, though I suppose you could argue in some senses perhaps there's a little too much emphasis on investment from the private sector and facilitating that, whereas you probably need a more active state approach. But I mean, if anything to advance the cause at this point, honestly, I will take. Yeah, so, and I suppose there's even that political point that we've become used to an enormous, unprecedented intervention in the face of a crisis. And it sort of expands the scope of political possibility in many senses. I think, Sinead, you already said that the world is already changing. We're already, it's going to change whether we like it or not. I suppose at this point it's fighting over every tenth of a degree. And so hopefully I mean, that's a frightening, but there's a lot of political kind of possibility in that. So.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that it's kind of, it can cut both ways. And the question for us is, are we organized enough? Do we have a good plan for the response? And yeah, and there are positives, like with the European Green Deal, for example. The Just Transition Fund can't go towards gas, it can't go towards nuclear, and arguably it can't go then towards like other damaging kind of climate activities. And at least 30%, I think, of the EU funding post-COVID is going to go towards climate action. And all proposals have to be kind of in line with climate action. So kind of further gas, further kind of oil activity is not going to be kind of funded under the new EU funding programme. But the problem is, and this is the interesting thing, because I think the lessons that I learned during the NESC report was that just because an action is a climate action, just because it's like a climate policy, does not mean that it's actually going to be a good policy. I mean, even in terms of climate mitigation, there's been so many kind of wrong turns taken because governments were so focused on climate action, I just will take whatever levers are there ready to hand, and not doing proper dialogue around it, not doing proper, or dialogue only with vested interests, and not doing kind of like a sort of systemic kind of thinking that's required. And the climate action funding from the EU is going to be attached to green taxonomy indicators. So the funding from the private sector is going to be, has to be in accordance with green indicators. Now, even then there's kind of debate over whether that will still go to gas, but there's the social indicators have not been developed. There's the European Pillar of Social Rights, which is there, but it's kind of not like, it hasn't been broken down in detail. And I think this is the kind of, post the last economic crash, I think maybe people were in shock and weren't adequately prepared for the austerity programs that were going to come in, and people thought that maybe this is a good idea. Well, now we know that austerity is an absolutely awful idea, but both from a climate and sort of a human perspective. It really cut the ends out of so many climate organizations. The National Parks and Wildlife Service, for example, was just cut to pieces. Loads of kind of organizations lost funding, while Biden's approach is just massive public investment, well, hopefully. And that was the approach of the Green Deal under Roosevelt as well. And I think that now is kind of, having learned those mistakes from last time, now we have the benefit of experience. I mean, even in my own lifetime, I'm only 30. I know that austerity is a terrible idea. So I think that we do, yeah, that there's positives to bring from that. And like a whole like Irish kind of population as well that experienced how a bad idea it was. But it is a question of organization and having that plan in place, having that shadow report, and so on, I think.
Well, that is somewhat positive. Look, I want to say thank you, Sinead, for a really wonderful presentation. And geez, by the looks of the questions here, we could have gone on for quite some time. But a really good engagement. And Paul, thank you as well for bringing in that perspective as well. So thanks a million, Sinead. Really was a great event. I will be shot if I don't mention that the NERI has further events coming up over the next few weeks. We have a seminar on the 19th of May from Colin McDermott of IGES and the department Deeper, looking at employment composition in small and large firms in Ireland. And then we have another one on the 23rd of June from Fran Bennett from Oxford University, looking at low pay and the living wage. But also as well to say that the 9th annual NERI Labour Market Conference is coming up this summer, and the call for papers is out, and the deadline is the 14th of May. But we had a great session online last year, and so we'll be online again this year. But it worked so well last year. I do have faith we'll have just as much fun with it this year. But listen, Sinead, thanks a million again, and it was a great event. But we have to end eventually. But hopefully this is just the beginning of hopefully much more of these type of events to bring this work to more and more people and to more and more groups. But I will leave it there. Thank you very much, everybody, and see you all soon.
Thank you. Thanks to Louisa as well for all the organising for myself. Thank you. And to both of you.